The defense headquarters has broken its silence on the airstrike incident in Kaduna, emphasizing that terrorists were embedded within the civilian population. In a statement issued earlier today, Director of Defense Media Operations Edward Buba disclosed that the airstrikes targeted terrorists observed by the Army's unmanned aerial vehicle UAV detachment in Ligarma, a notorious haven for insurgents. He added that terrorists often deliberately embed themselves within civilian population centers for them to bear the consequences of their atrocities. Buba expressed regret for civilian casualties and emphasized the military's commitment to minimizing such tragic incidents by making diligent efforts to distinguish between civilians and terrorists during operations. Meanwhile, the Nigerian army has accepted responsibility for the incident, acknowledging that the troops on a routine mission against terrorists made a mistake that led to the tragic bombing. To further discuss this, I'm joined by security analyst Salaudeen Hashimu. Thank you very much, Salaudeen, for giving us your time. Yesterday, I had this conversation with another security expert, Makri, and what he said was that it was an error. It could happen. It could happen anytime, though regrettable. So I'm going to ask, instead of asking for why this is allowed to happen, how can the Nigerian army enhance its intelligence gathering to accurately identify and locate terrorists without risking civilian lives?
All right, thank you very much for having me. I think it would be nice to first of all express this deep and unequivocal concern over this accidental bombing that has resulted in the tragic death of most civilians. I think the number is actually surging to about 85 or thereabout. What we saw played out very clearly was an operational incompetence, very clearly. Yes, in counterterrorism theaters, we have what we call collateral damage. But of course, these are something that is actually and often happen when intelligence failure occurs. And let me take your mind back very slightly. That this very regrettable but unavoidable incident has become a concerning pattern of negligence in counterinsurgency efforts. It is very disturbing that the challenge that is currently happening, we saw happen in Borno in 2017, that resulted into the death of about 52 persons and over 120 injuries. In Katsina, we saw this happen in 2022, and then of course we saw this played out where over 36 persons also lost their lives in Kwantiri, a small village settlement in Nasarawa, and of course again, we have seen this happen in Kaduna. So it tells you very clearly that there is a huge operational incompetence that is happening. And what has played out? It tells you very clearly that there is a huge rivalry going on between the Nigerian Army and the Nigerian Air Force. The Army Aviation is actually beginning to test its own operations using aerial and, of course, unguided vehicle, aerial unguided vehicle, to also carry out these kinds of assaults. And of course, because they are not trained in that particular regard, they are actually trained for ground operations. Then, of course, getting into aerial operation obviously will result into this kind of colossal damage, and of course, very embarrassing, and of course, a very damaging situation that has confronted us. And I think this is very unfortunate. And of course, the excuse,
am I correct in inferring that you think this is avoidable? Incidents like this are actually avoidable?
They are actually avoidable if those who have the mandates to use aerial operations are deployed. And Nigerian Air Force had actually distanced itself to say that in the last 24 hours, after that incident occurred, they didn't carry out any operations, which means very clearly that for the army to have also owned up, it was the army who actually deployed its own aviation platform into that particular region, and it ended up in that colossal damage. And of course, you know too well that the army had no presence and no business in actually deploying aerial surveillance and assault. It is actually the job of the Nigerian Air Force, and the Air Force had distanced themselves. This tragic incident actually provides.
So what is at the heart of this rivalry that is resulting in the loss of life? Isn't it something that can be dealt with?
The president was very clear when he actually brought in these service chiefs, and he said entirely, and I quote him very clearly, that not under his watch would he experience any form of intelligence rivalry between all the services, and then of course asking them to share intelligence, to work together, to collaborate, to communicate, and to coordinate better. But what we have seen clearly is actually a failure to respond in that manner. And I think the president has just returned to the country, and I expect to see an immediate policy direction that will be translated into a query into the Nigerian Army to ask, one, that the Nigerian Army should immediately investigate and set up a panel to inquire what actually went wrong in that operation. Two, why did the Nigerian Army deploy an area operation when they are very special in ground operations? And thirdly, to make that report public, because of course, strategic communication is at the center of counterterrorism effort. And finally, for me, is that the Terrorism Prevention Act 2022, as amended, stipulates very clearly that compensation for victims in situations like this should actually be very paramount. If you look at Section 91 of the Act, it establishes terrorism victims trust fund, which is designed to pay compensation and restitutions and damages to victims of acts of terrorism. So I think there's again the need to begin to look at very clearly how victims who have suffered damages and fatalities should be compensated under this particular framework. And then again, for me, is the question of the protection of civilians. How then have we localized, institutionalized, and then of course brought the conversation around civilian protection in armed conflicts to the fore? We cannot continue to record fatalities and come out with flimsy and pedestrian excuses to say, look, that it was because terrorists were embedding themselves within civilian population. That is pedestrian, and I think that the Nigerian Army spokesperson could have done a lot better other than what they have just said.
All right, while investigation is ongoing, I mean, one of the reasons we have this conversation is to help educate ourselves from experts like yourself how things can be better. What training protocols and guidelines could be introduced to ensure that unmanned aerial vehicle, the UAV detachments, effectively differentiate between terrorists and civilians, especially in complex environments?
I mean, as you have heard, is an unmanned aerial vehicle, and which most of the time just picked a coordinate. So if it picks a coordinate to say that this is where an information earlier provided had occurred, then of course you want to then guide. And of course, it is also about the precision. And like I mentioned earlier, if you are not trained and you are not provided the expertise to actually deploy it, then you can miss any single movement, and then of course you go off radar. So it is very important for me first to carry out an evaluation of the Nigerian Army aviation platforms and see how functionalities. Two is to look at the personnel who are actually currently manning all of these platforms and see what are the certification and the capabilities and the capacity they have in this particular regard. Because to be very honest, if we do not get very close into understanding and evaluating all of these things, opportunities are there that we might begin to have situations. And again, for me, is that we need to set up the Nigerian Armed Forces Council, Armed Forces Service Commission, the Nigerian Service Subcommission, Nigerian Armed Forces Service Commission will be able to respond in situations like this. as a way of providing some kind of guided direction, some kind of code of conduct, and how to consistently provide the needed coordination among agencies. But each of these agencies working in silos, not sharing information, would consistently put civilian population at risk. And for me, this is not the best way to go. There must be a deliberate effort to guide and guard and prevent the reoccurrence of this situation from happening again. Otherwise, it will create for us a more challenging circumstances that we may not be able to recover from in the near future.
My next question is still, how can, correct me if I'm wrong, information is fluid, intelligence could change any minute. So how can the military improve its response mechanism to promptly rectify situations where civilians may be inadvertently affected during anti-terrorism operations like we just saw?
Information is different from intelligence. Your response rate to an information is what actually determines whether or not you have actually dealt with it. Information is what it is until you process it before it becomes intelligence. And if you don't respond to an intelligence within a particular time frame, opportunities are there that you may have lost it. And that, for me, is actually where the challenges lies with our government institutions, particularly response agencies who should actually lead counterinsurgency operations. If you miss specific time frame, because there's a bracket within which an intelligence must be responded to. And that, for me, perhaps was what happened. Coupled with the fact that what we saw played out was actually an issue of coordinate. It wasn't an issue that targeted a particular location outside where civilian populations were actually gathering. I mean, of course, it was very clear that those populations were actually celebrating the Ezewuike celebration, which unfortunately turned out to be celebrating their funeral because they were unfortunately geographically located in an area where counterinsurgency operation was actually ongoing. So information is what it is. If you process it, that is where you have intelligence.
Okay.
And if you don't respond to an intelligence within a particular time bracket, it goes back to become an information, which means that you have to process it again before you can make use of it as an intelligence for which you can act upon.
Salaudeen, thank you very much for your insightful contribution. We appreciate it.